stories of imagination are never far. They still reside in us, guiding us ever forward. Join us now as we journey forward into the past. And here is your host, J.C. Rede.
Hi everyone. Welcome to the first episode of Forward into the Past. I'm J.C. Rede, your host and narrator, and the first story we're going to delve into comes from the famous Nick Carter stories of the turn of the 20th century. Yes, famous. Well, who is this Nick Carter, you ask? Well, I'm glad you asked that. Nick Carter was a character created in 1886 from an idea from Ormond G. Smith. Now, Ormond was the son of Francis Smith, one of the founders of the publishing house Street and Smith. Street and Smith was one of the biggest publishers of what would soon become known as dime novels. At the time, Street and Smith were publishing what were then known as story papers, which were newspaper-style publications that featured several short stories or serials. Now, Smith wanted to create a detective character to compete with other characters like the Old Sleuth and other detective characters that had started 10 years earlier. Now, Smith, however, wanted to create a new type of detective that was seemingly younger than the stories that had a strong following. Nick Carter was young, strong, and embodied clean living, meaning no booze or tobacco were featured in the stories, which was very progressive for his time. Now, he gained a strong following very quickly and was given his own weekly magazine, one of the first fictional characters from the story papers to do so. Now, for a while, he was called the American Sherlock Holmes, which was actually very, very incorrect, since the Nick Carter stories debuted a full year before Sherlock Holmes. Now, by the time the dime novels and pulp magazines were dying out, around 1950, it had been estimated that Nick Carter, in his various incarnations, had appeared in over 4,000 stories, including comics, movies, radio shows, and of course, dime novels and pulp magazines, making him arguably the most published character in American fiction. Now, this fact astounds me because until I began researching stories to read for this podcast, I had never even heard of Nick Carter, and I'm sure many of you have not either. Now, to rectify these wrongs, as Detective Carter might say, I decided that for the first several podcasts, I will focus almost exclusively on Nick Carter's early escapades. Now, don't worry, I will also begin reading some short stories from the sci-fi and adventure pulps as well, but for the moment, detective stories will be our main suspects. Stories of interest. Now, we will begin with one of the earliest Nick Carter stories in Project Gutenberg's vast library, The Crime of the French Café, written in 1893, found in the free ebook The Crime of the French Café and Other Stories by Nicholas Carter. The Crime of the French Café by Nicholas Carter. Chapter 1. Private Dining Room B. There is a well-known French restaurant in the Tenderloin district, which provides its patrons with small but elegantly appointed private dining rooms. The restaurant occupies a corner house, and, though its reputation is not strictly first class in some respects, its cook is an artist, and its wine cellar as good as the best. It has 2 entrances, and the one on the side street is not well lighted at night. At 7:30 one evening, Nick Carter was standing about 50 yards away from this side door. The detective had shadowed a man to a house on the side street, and was waiting for him to come out. The case was a robbery of no great importance, but Nick had taken it to oblige a personal friend who wished to have the business managed quietly. This affair would not be worth mentioning, except that it led Nick to one of the most peculiar and interesting criminal puzzles that he had ever come across in all his varied experience. While Nick waited for his man, he saw a closed carriage stop before the side door of the restaurant. Almost immediately, a waiter, bareheaded and wearing his white apron, came hurriedly out of the side door and got into the carriage, which instantly moved away at a rapid rate. This incident struck Nick as being very peculiar, The waiter had acted like a man who was running away. As he crossed the sidewalk, he glanced hastily from side to side, as if afraid of being seen, and perhaps stopped. It looked as if the waiter might have robbed one of the restaurant's patrons, or possibly its proprietor. If Nick had had no business on his hands, he would have followed that carriage. As it happened, however, the man for whom the detective was watching appeared at that moment. Nick was obliged to follow him, but he knew that he would not have far to go, for Chick was waiting on 6th Avenue, and it was in that direction that the thief turned. So it happened that within 10 minutes, Nick was able to turn this case over to his famous assistant and return to clear up the mystery of the queer incident which he had chanced to observe. Nick would not have been surprised to find the restaurant in an uproar, but it was as quiet as usual. He entered by the side door, ascended a flight of stairs, and came to a sort of office with a desk and register. It was the custom of the place that guests should put down their names as in a hotel before being assigned to a private dining room. There was nobody in sight. The hall led toward the front of the building, and there were 3 rooms on the side of it toward the street. All the doors were open and the rooms were empty. Nick glanced into these rooms and then turned toward the desk. As he did so, he saw a waiter coming down the stairs from the floor above. This man was known by the name of Gaspard. He was the head waiter and was on duty in the lower hall. "Ah, Gaspard," said Nick. "Who is your waiter on this floor tonight?" Gaspard looked at Nick anxiously. He did not, of course, know who the detective really was, but he remembered him as one who had assisted the police in a case in which that house had been concerned about 2 years before. "Jean Corbett," replied Gaspard. "I hope nothing is wrong." "Well, that remains to be seen," said Nick. "What sort of a man is this Corbett?" "A little man," answered Gaspard, "and very thin. He has long black hair and mustaches pointed like 2 needles. "Have you sent him out for anything?" "Oh, no, he is here." "Where?"
"In one of the rooms at the front. We have parties in A and B."
"You go and find him," said Nick. "I want to see him right away." Gaspard went to the front of the house. A hall branched off at right angles with that in which Nick was standing. On the second hall were 3 rooms, A, B, and C. Room C was next the avenue. The other 2 had windows on an open space between the 2 wings of the building. Nick glanced at the register and saw that R.M. Clark and wife had been assigned to Room A, and John Jones and wife to Room B. Room C was vacant. The detective had barely time to note these entries on the book when Gaspard came running back. His face was as white as paper, and his lips were working as if they were saying something, but not a sound came from them. He was struck dumb with fright. Whatever it was that he had seen must have been horrible to judge the man's trembling lips and distorted face. Nick had seen people in that condition before, and he did not waste time trying to get any information out of Gaspard. Instead, he seized the frightened fellow by the shoulder and pushed him along toward the front of the house. Gaspard made a feeble resistance. Evidently he did not want to see again the sight which had so terrified him. But he was powerless in Nick's grasp. In 5 seconds they stood before the open door of Room B. The door was open, and there was a bright glare of gas within. It shone upon the table, where a rich repast lay untasted. It illumined the gaudy furnishings of the room and the costly pictures upon the walls. It shone, too, upon a beautiful face, rigid and perfectly white, except for a horrible stain of black and red upon the temple. The face was that of a woman of 25 years. She had very abundant hair of a light corn color, which clustered in little curls around her forehead, and was gathered behind in a great mass of plaited braids. She reclined in a large easy-chair in a natural attitude, but the pallid face, the fixed and glassy eyes, and the grim wound upon the temple announced in unmistakable terms the presence of death. Nick drew a long breath and set his lips together firmly. He had felt that something was wrong in that house. The waiter who had run across the sidewalk and got into that carriage had borne a guilty secret with him, as the detective's experienced eye had instantly perceived.
But this was a good deal worse than Nick had expected. He had looked for a robbery, or perhaps a secret and bloody quarrel between two of the waiters, but not for a murder such as this. One glance at the woman showed her to be elegant in dress and of a refined appearance. She could have nothing in common with the missing Corbett, unless indeed he was other than he seemed. Certainly, whatever was Corbett's connection with the crime, there was another person, at least, as intimately concerned in it, and he, too, had fled. Where was the man who had brought this woman to this house? How was it possible to account for his absence except by the conclusion that he was the murderer? That was the first and most natural explanation. Whether it was the true one or not, the man must be found. Nick turned to Gaspard. The head waiter had sunk down on a chair by the table and seemed prostrated. From previous experience, Nick knew Gaspard to be a man without nerve, and he was not surprised to find him prostrated by this sudden shock. There was a bottle of champagne standing in ice beside the table. The detective opened it and made Gaspard drink a glass of the sparkling liquor. It put a little heart into the man, and he was able to answer questions. Nick, meanwhile, closed the door of the room. Apparently the tragedy was known only to Gaspard and himself, and to the guilty authors of it. "Did you see this woman when she came in?" asked Nick.
"No."
"Who showed her and the man with her to this room?"
"Corbett."
"Who waited on them?"
"Corbett."
"Who waited on the people in room A?"
"Corbett."
"They are gone, I suppose?"
"Yes. I looked in there before I came in here."
"Did you see any of these people?"
"I saw the two men."
"How did that happen?"
"One of them came out into the hall to call Corbett, who had not answered the bell quick enough."
"Which one was that?"
"The man in room A."
"How do you know?"
"Because I saw the other man later coming out of room B."
"This room?"
"Yes."
"You are sure of that?"
"Perfectly."
"Did he see you?"
"I think not. I was standing right at the corner of the two halls. The man came out and glanced around, but I stepped back quickly because we do not like to appear to spy on our guests. He did not see me."
"What did he do?"
"He went out the front way. I suppose the lady went with him, for I was sure that I heard the rustling of her dress."
"Where was Corbett, then?"
"In room A."
"How long did he stay there?"
"Only a minute. I went back to check the desk and then was called by a waiter upstairs. Just as I turned to go, I saw Corbett coming through the hall."
"Did you speak to him?"
"Yes. I called him to stay by the desk while I went upstairs."
"Did he answer?"
"Yes. He said, 'Very well.'"
"And that's the last you saw of him?"
"Yes."
"All right. So much for Corbett. Now for the two men. Would you know them?"
"Not the man in room A. I did not notice him particularly."
But how about the man who came out of this room? He's the one we're after."
"I would know him," said Gaspard slowly. "Yes, I feel sure that I could identify him."
"Well, that's good. Now for the crime itself. Go back to the desk and ring for a messenger. When he comes, send him here. Don't let anybody else come, and don't say a word to anybody about this affair." Gaspard, with a very pale face, went back to his desk. Nick remained alone with the beautiful dead. Chapter 2. Gaspard spots his man. A revolver lay on the carpet just where it would have been if it had been dropped from the woman's right hand. Its position suggested the possibility of suicide, and there was, at the first glance, nothing to contradict that theory, except the conduct of Corbett and the man who had registered as John Jones. It might be that the woman had committed suicide, and the men had fled for fear of being implicated in the affair. Nick examined this side of the case at once. The pistol had evidently been held only a few inches from the woman's head when it was fired. Her white flesh showed the marks of the powder. The bullet had passed straight through her head. The revolver carried a long .32 cartridge. 3 of the 5 chambers were loaded. One of them contained an empty shell on which the hammer rested. The fatal bullet had doubtless come from this chamber, for the shell had been recently discharged. In the 5th chamber was an old shell, which had apparently been carried under the hammer for safety, as is quite common. The woman had a purse containing about $20, but no cards or other things which might lead to identification. Her ears had been pierced for earrings, but she seemed not to have worn them recently. She had no watch. There was one plain gold ring on the 3rd finger of her right hand, and there was a deep mark showing that she had worn another, but that ring was gone. How recently it had been removed was, of course, beyond discovery. There was no sign that it had been violently torn away. When Nick had proceeded thus far with his investigation, the messenger boy arrived. The detective sent messages to his assistants, Chick and Patsy. He then notified a coroner, who came about 10 o'clock and took charge of the body. A minute examination failed to reveal any marks upon the clothing which might assist in establishing the woman's identity. Nick then left the restaurant, taking Gaspard with him. Inspector McLaughlin's men were by this time on hand, and they took charge of the house under Nick's direction. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Nick received a message from Patsy, who had been directed to find the cabman in whose cab Corbett had fled. Patsy had located the cabman at his home on West 32nd Street. The man's name was Harrigan. Nick took Gaspard with him and went to the house where Harrigan boarded.
I got onto him easy enough,
said Patsy, whom they found outside the house. I found the policeman who was on that beat last night and got him to give me a list of all the nighthawks he'd seen around there up to 8 o'clock of the evening. Then I began to chase up the fellows on that list. The second man put me on to Harrigan. He remembered seeing him get the job, but couldn't tell me what sort of a man hired him. I guess there's no doubt that he's the man, but I haven't questioned him yet. He's in there asleep. Nick passed himself off as a friend of Harrigan's and was directed with Patsy to the man's room. They went in without being invited, after having tried in vain to get an answer to their pounding on his door. The cabman was snoring in a heavy slumber.
From what I heard, said Patsy, Harrigan had a very large skate on last night. He's sleeping it off.
Nick shook the man unmercifully, and at last he sat up in bed.
What the hell?
Said he, looking about him wildly.
Who are yous, and what's all the row?
As the quickest way to sober the man, Nick showed his shield. It acted like a cold shower bath.
Say, what was it I done? Gasped Harrigan. S'help me, I don't know nothing about it. I had a load on me last night, and I ain't responsible.
Patsy laughed. There's no charge against you, said Nick. I only want to ask you a few questions. Harrigan sank back on his pillow with a gasp of relief.
Give me that water pitcher, he said. Me throat's full of cobwebs.
He drank about a quart of water, and then declared himself ready for a cross-examination. Nick sized him up for a decent sort of fellow, and saw no reason to doubt that he was telling the truth when he answered the questions that were put to him. It appeared that he had been on 7th Avenue near the French restaurant from a little after 6 to about 7:30 on the previous evening. At the latter hour, a man had engaged his cab. He had taken it to the side door of the restaurant, and the waiter had got in. The man who hired the cab was already inside. He had driven them somewhere on 57th Street, or it might be 58th. He couldn't remember exactly. The two men got out together. He didn't know what had become of them. His fare was paid all right. Then he had a couple more drinks, and the next thing he knew he was at the stable where he had hired the cab. Of course, he didn't confess this in so many words, but Nick understood the facts well enough. That was absolutely all that Harrigan knew about the case. Would you recognize the man who hired your cab if you saw him again? Asked Nick.
Oh, sure, said Harrigan. I wasn't so very full. Had me wits about me. Say, you ain't gonna do me dirt and get me license taken away. I was all right. I didn't do any harm.
Nick assured Harrigan that if he acted right in this case, his license would be safe, and then left the man to his slumbers. Not very promising, is it, my boy? Said Nick to Patsy as they went downstairs. We've lost the trail as soon as we struck it.
Do you think he's giving it to us straight?
Yes. He doesn't know where he took the men or what became of them after they left his cab.
It's a pity he had such a jag. He'd have been the best witness in the case.
Nick smiled. If he hadn't been drunk, he wouldn't have had anything to do with the case, he said.
What do you mean?
Why, it's clear enough. This man that we want saw Harrigan on that cab while the man was on his way to the restaurant with the woman. Then, when it became necessary to get Corbett out of the way, he remembered the drunken cabman and hired him.
I don't see how you know that.
A man would rather have a sober driver than a drunken one, wouldn't he?
Yes.
Well, the man who told you he saw Harrigan get the job was sober, wasn't he?
Yes.
Then why didn't the man take his cab? Because he wanted a drunken driver who wouldn't be sharp enough to get onto any queer business. But he wouldn't have tried to find a drunken cabman just by luck, and he wouldn't have taken a sober one. Therefore, he had seen Harrigan and hoped to find him in the same place. That's part of the plot. Now then, you go to Chick, who's watching the body of the woman. I'm going to take Gaspard uptown and have a look at that part of the city where Harrigan left his passengers. Nick and Gaspard went to the 33rd Street station of the 6th Avenue elevated road. They walked to the edge of the platform on the uptown end. Suddenly, Gaspard gave a violent start. He uttered an exclamation of surprise and pointed across the tracks. "What is it?" cried Nick.
"The man who is in room B!" exclaimed Gaspard. "I am sure of it!"
At that instant, a downtown train rushed into the station, cutting off Nick's view. And, a half-second later, an uptown train pulled in on their side. Nick pushed open a gate before the train had fairly stopped. He dragged Gaspard after him. The gateman tried to stop them, but Nick pushed the fellow in the car so violently that he sat down on the floor. Then the detective pulled the other gate open and, still dragging Gaspard, sprang down in the space between the tracks. The other train was just starting. Nick leaped up and opened one of the gates. Gaspard stood trembling. Excitement and terror rendered him incapable of action. Nick reached down and, seizing the man by the shoulders, lifted him up to the platform of the car as if he had been a child of 10. "Look back," cried the detective, pushing Gaspard to the other side of the car. "Is your man still at the station?" 2 or 3 men were there, having apparently just missed the train. It seemed possible that the criminal, if such he was, had seen Gaspard point and had been shrewd enough not to board the car. But Gaspard looked back and declared that his man was not there. "Good," said Nick. "He must be on the train. We have him sure." Has Nick found the right man? Who is the woman murdered at the cafe? Who was the second person in the cab? The answer to these questions and more may be found in the next thrilling episode of Nick Carter, Master Detective. I always wanted to say stuff like that. Hey folks, thanks for listening. Next podcast will be out soon. Once again, special thanks go out to Project Gutenberg and the tireless volunteers there. Thanks for keeping these stories alive for us and for future generations. Well, until next time, folks, thanks for listening, share your stories, and if you'd like, buy me a coffee. Be a good human. Bye now.